1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Melbourne-based Master of Wine, Meg Brodtmann. Meg wears many hats. Among other things, she's a winemaker, lead educator for the local offering of the Wine and Spirits Education Trust, and co-presenter of the award-winning podcast Wine with Meg and Mel. We now teach together, but I first encountered Meg as one of her WSET students many moons ago. We talk a little bit about the value of education, as well as post-communist harvests and vodka-fueled tea breaks in Eastern Europe, a flying winemaker's guide to Gaillac, Carmenere, consulting and kid-raising in Chile, why wine's ubiquitous blokiness still prevails, what your podcast audience teaches you, and how fine Blanc de Blanc champagne takes the edge off everything. I started by asking Meg where it all began.
Well, I started out in Yallourn, which is now a big coal pit, because my dad was in the SEC, the State Electricity Commission, as a sparky. So we were there, but then we moved back to Balwyn, and then we moved into Blackburn. So I've grown up in Melbourne eastern suburbs pretty much my entire life, and I would just say I'm the middle child. So I don't know if I need to say any more. My mother calls me the middle monster. So I had the perfect older sister, and then the kind of super bright but dumb as, a log of wood in sort of life skills younger sister, who's a neurologist now. She's a professor of neurology. But yeah, I grew up as the mouthy, naughty one, and I pretty much could say that we haven't changed really much, Ed, as you probably know.
You mentioned your older sister and younger sister being pretty bright. The whole family, there's a bit of science and academia running right through, isn't there?
Yeah, so my older sister was in Parliament, so she was the federal member for Parliament under the Gillard-Rudd government, and she's always been into change management, so she works with Department of Defence to sort of make them less blokey, I guess, would be the best way of putting it. My younger sister, yes, is a neurologist, and I did start in science. When I finished school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I actually chose winemaking as my last option, so you had to do 8 options to go to university because you could fail. And I thought, oh, well, that's a good backup. I can fail and go to Roseworthy and still do, something. But I did Monash Science. I did Bachelor of Science with honours at Monash University.
And so when did that convert to a winemaking thing?
So I was doing honours, and scientists and doctors are really into wine, and so we would always talk about wine. Back in the day, The Age used to have an insert on Tuesdays called Epicure, which covered wine. There was a wine writer called Mark Shield, I think he was. He died quite young, a rather tragic death from memory. And we would read that, and then we'd buy wine. We'd buy sort of unlabelled wine and, clean skins. And I just really got into wine then, and I remember having a dinner. We were celebrating something, but we had a 1987, which I think might have been the first release of the Cloudy Bay Sauvignon Blanc, and I was just blown away that I could identify. It tasted like something. It was like passion fruit, and I remember we were at a restaurant in Camberwell and just thinking, oh my God, I can taste these things. Prior to that, I had drunk Fruity Lexia, Chablis in a cask, so I drank wine, but I was not a connoisseur. I was a student, I didn't have a big budget.
When you say Chablis in a cask, what was that? Presumably that wasn't Chablis, though.
I'm guessing probably a bit of Sultana with possibly some Chenin Blanc in there to give it a little bit of acid. I think it was a Stanley brand. I can still see the cask, but it was labelled as Chablis. So it was obviously prior to 1996, which was when we introduced the sort of bilateral agreement that we weren't going to use European names. But last week I actually had lunch with a friend of mine who used to drink it with me, and he lives in the States and has done for years, and we were catching up for lunch, and he was just saying we seemed to think it was a really good drop, but it went with all the cheap, takeaway restaurants, or restaurants where you could take wine. So we'd rock up with like glasses, casks of wine, and they give you those bulb glasses, and we do think we're pretty posh.
Pretty posh with your fancy Chablis.
With our fancy Chablis. I still love Chablis, but the real stuff now.
Yeah, not so boxy. And so when did that taste of your Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc turn then into a bit more curiosity?
So, yeah, I decided I didn't want to stay in science because my only route was really a PhD. And I saw my boss, who, you know, in hindsight, she was probably only about in her early 30s, putting in grants to try and get funding. It was when AIDS was big. It was the late 80s, so we got a lot of HIV, AIDS. We didn't even know it was HIV then, but AIDS funding. And I was working on immunodeficiencies in children, and I decided that I just wanted to get out. So I ended up nannying for her and looking after her child, and did the wine marketing course from Roseworthy by correspondence. You know, this is before online and everything, so you write your essays and you send them off in the post, and then they get your marks back, and you used to go over there twice a year. And then I just thought, oh, stuff it. I had a bad romance and I really wanted to get out of Melbourne. So I thought, I'm just going to apply to go and study winemaking at Roseworthy / University of Adelaide, because it was going through the amalgamation time. Yes, I just moved to Adelaide and started studying winemaking.
And how did you fit in? I mean, obviously you come from, you know, pretty high flying. I know you do yourself down a bit with the science background, but pretty serious academic side of things, and then freeing yourself like that to go somewhere else. How did you find it from the word go?
Well, I think there was 30 of us when I started, and 13 of us graduated. So it was a tiny cohort, mostly older people. So we had a guy who was a radiologist. We had a woman who was a vet. We had a guy from a hospo background, a guy from a law background. There were a few straight out of high school students. Most of them actually didn't finish. They'd grown up in winemaking regions, so there was one in the Coonawarra and one from the Swan Valley. It was a great group. I mean, there was Pete Shell, who's Spinifex Wine, my mate Russell Lake, who was at Ripon Vineyard in New Zealand. They were two Kiwis. Michael, he ended up at Howard Park. Yeah, they've all gone on to bigger and better things.
Fairly bloke dominated back then?
Yeah. I started with Claire Halloran, who was a winemaker at Tarrawarra, and another girl called Jan Gibson, who was sort of my age. And then there was a girl called Shelley, who was a vet, and she dropped out. Her parents had bought a vineyard, so she just dropped out. She didn't end up doing it. Bryony, I can't remember her surname. She was quite young. I think she ended up in the sort of Treasury wine estate. There was a handful of women, but yes, very, very blokey, which, you know, just sort of paved the way for what my life was going to be going forward.
As the mouthy middle sister, did you still muck in and have fun with the course and enjoy it all?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I lived in downtown Adelaide. I was sharing with a flatmate of mine who was from Melbourne, and he was at the State Theatre Company, so I got to go to the theatre all the time for free, which was great. I was 20 minutes to Waite campus, an hour and a bit to Roseworthy. And because we were such a small group, we were all very good friends. We'd go, there was a hotel called the Edinburgh Hotel, and as winemaking students, we were allowed to buy wine out of the bottle shop and actually bring it in and pay no corkage as long as we showed our student ID. So we drank some amazing wines. You know, we pooled all our money together to buy something fancy. I remember one night a guy turned up at my house and he'd smashed a bottle of Grange on the way over on his motorbike. And so he went back to the shop and he said, "Oh, it's your fault. You know, you should have bagged it up properly." And they actually replaced it for him. So,
wow.
Yeah, those times have changed, obviously. But it was good fun. Really good fun.
Yeah, you'd be pretty upset if you smashed a bottle of that these days.
Yeah, he was Daniel Corso. He was from Tassie. His family was in wine. I think he ended up in America somewhere.
And did you do a few placements in other regions?
So during your course, you have to do one placement in your final year. So the first half of your final year, you're basically not at uni. And I was supposed to go to Wirra Wirra, and then about 2 weeks out from Vintage, they contacted me and said, "Oh no, actually we don't need you. We think the harvest is going to be a little bit smaller." So I just panicked, and I ended up getting something at Domaine Chandon in the Yarra Valley. So because I was from Melbourne, I could move back, stay with mum, and work at Domaine Chandon. So I did I think 16 weeks. It was actually quite a long vintage. It rained. It was just wet and miserable. And then went back to uni and finished off my sort of degree.
And where was your first gig then after uni?
So during my degree, I'd come back over the summer holidays and mid-semester breaks and everything, and I'd work at Yarra Ridge in the Yarra Valley. I did a little bit of time at St Hubert's as well. Just I'd work in the lab because obviously I had good lab skills, but I'd also help in the winery as well. But my first true winemaking gig on my own was in Gaillac in France.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't really speak French, even though I said I did. I thought that if you could get a beer and, a packet of cigarettes and some cassoulet, that was enough French that you needed. But I managed to bluster my way through that vintage, and the woman who employed me, so it was through a UK-based company, Cellar World International, she was, I think, so impressed by the fact that I just didn't call anyone for any help. I just kind of dug in and got things done with the help of a great friend of mine, Delphine, who was French. And they offered me a permanent job working for them after that. So I was based in the UK. I came back to Australia and did a vintage at Heathcote Estate while my visa was being sorted out. And then I went back to the UK where I spent 6 years working for them.
And so, just quickly, Gaillac would be an area that I think a lot of people wouldn't be particularly familiar with wines from there. What were you making?
So this was sort of during the 90s when Australian fruit-driven styles were really popular, and a lot of the UK supermarkets were finding that their sort of entry-level whites and things weren't really fruity enough. So we were called flying winemakers. We were brought in to sort of apply Australian winemaking standards, which, to be honest, Ed, was just about cleaning and having a little bit of a carbon dioxide blanket on the wine and fruit selection. Because when you're working in these large cooperatives, the members own the winery and they just pick their fruit when they want to. So, in Gaillac, we instituted a system of, yes, your fruit's ready. We'd go out and sample the fruit and we'd book them in so they wouldn't just be lined up for days outside. I was making Londeloy, which is kind of Aligoté-esque, I guess, would be crap Chardonnay. Mosaic. So I made a lot of Pearl, which is this sparkling base with the second fermentation in the bottle by accident quite often. We did a lot of Gamay as a Nouveau style, so there'd be big parties in November and we'd release these horrific wines, but it was a cultural thing more than a enjoy the great wine thing. Brocol. There was another one starting with D. Duras?
Yes.
There was Shiraz, there was Cabernet, there was Merlot, there was some Sauvignon, there was Chardonnay, but they weren't the appellation grape varieties. They were Van de Pay wines. So we made the wines for Hardy's. So Hardy's employed us, and so we made them, and then they'd sell them into the big supermarkets like Waitrose and Sainsbury's and Asda. So we'd follow them through right till and sort of final finishing around December. So they would have been fined, but they wouldn't be ready for bottle. And yeah, then I got offered a permanent job.
Obviously threw yourself in the deep end, sort of bluffed your way with the lack of French. How was that experience? Was it fun? I mean, you must have learnt a lot, and you say that, it was largely, I suppose, the control of operations there, but still managing all of that, dealing with the cultural issues, must have been quite a baptism of fire.
It was great fun. My friend Delphine, who's a friend to this day, was a great help because obviously she spoke French, but I'd only ever worked in quite beautiful modern wineries. I didn't understand the concept of bulk wine, and see, a lot of what we were doing was bulk wine, so wine that was going to be then on-sold to someone else later in the day. And just the massive volumes. I'd come from the Yarra Valley, which was, at Yarra Ridge we did 1,000 tonne. We could be putting through 1,000 tonne in a week in these wineries that were built in the 1930s. They were very cooperative minded, often underground, so a lot of the tanks would be underground, which is dangerous with carbon dioxide and everything. One toilet, one bloke's toilet. So Delphine and I drive home to our little gîte if we needed to go to the loo. It was fun. We used to sit around at 5 o'clock and we'd have saucisson and we'd have a little martini rouge, the sweet vermouth with some ice, and go through all our analysis for the day and work out what needed to be done for the night shift. And the crew were great, even though I didn't really speak French. There was a lot of Algerian people there and they were great fun, and they'd cook, and it was awesome. It was tough, but it was fun.
And so Cellar World, great name. I love it. It's the kind of name you'd make up if you were trying to think of a corporation to cover so many different areas, because this was making wine from, I gather, places as far-flung as Moldova, Romania, South Africa,
Yeah.
Chile, etc. So that was, I guess, also an eye-opener. You say the concept of bulk wine, but I guess that whole movement of mass resources from all these really quite distinct places.
Yeah, it was after the fall of the Iron Curtain, basically, so 96 onwards, and there was a lot of European bank money and World Bank money being thrown into Romania and Moldova. They were interesting countries because they still had a real communist mindset. So I worked in a winery where we shared our must pump, so the pump that can pump solids, with the jam making factory next door. So they would use it at night, we would use it during the day, and it'd come back with pits of plums and everything. We'd have to clean it. Working in, was it either Moldova or Romania, the pressed doors were stolen. So I don't know how they got them off, and they used them as a barbecue. My water would freeze sort of around October, and so you couldn't flush your toilet or have a shower or anything. But it was good. We'd get little Tetra packs of vodka, which, in hindsight we shouldn't have done, but we'd hand them out at the smoko, and I always would drive in with piles of Marlboro red cigarettes. And so at smoko you got a 200ml Tetra pack of vodka and 2 Marlboro Reds, and that was smoko. Not very ethical.
Yes, people do often like to point out that behind the scenes, the wine industry isn't quite as glamorous as you might think.
No, we always say it takes a lot of beer to make wine, but in those Eastern Bloc countries, it was a lot of really bad vodka. I tried it once and I didn't touch it after that. It was literally methylated spirits. It was so awful.
Right, so just stuck with the Marlboro Reds then. How long did you spend at Cellar World?
So I was at Cellar World for 6 years, and then a lovely Kiwi winemaker came to work for us, and I think that was in 99. I quite fancied him, and then he went off and did a vintage with us in Chile, and I was over there because we had 2 projects in Chile and 1 in Argentina, so I was sort of between the two, and one of the projects was a wee bit of a disaster, so I spent a lot more time there than I imagined, but it was good because I was with this cute bloke. And then at the end of that vintage, he was offered a permanent job in Chile, so Pete, he's now my husband, no surprises, he came back and did a vintage in the south of France, and I was still working with Angela at Cellar World, and then I resigned and we moved to Chile for the vintage of 2001, I think. Yeah, 2001. I didn't have a job. I bought a one-way ticket, and when I got there they said, well, you need a visa. And I said, oh, but my partner's here, he's working. And so they gave me this temporary visa, and it took me, I got my permanent visa 6 months before we left the country. To move back to Australia. It took that long.
Sorry, how many years later was that?
It was nearly 8 years.
Wow.
So I was it was called Intramite. So I'd go down every 3 months to this office, this beautiful colonial Spanish office in San Fernando, and I had coffee with this lady who I was great friends with, Cecilia, and she'd stamp me in and stamp me out and say, you've got 3 more months, and then I go back in 3 months. One time we went on holiday to Patagonia, but we travelled into Argentina. There's all the lakes down there, and we put our car on a logging boat, so we were just there with all the workers. And I got to this literally tin shed, and I said, oh, here's all our passports. We'd had kids by then, and he said, well, you don't have a visa to get back into Chile. And I said, no, it's all good because I'm in Tramite, and you just have to go online and check. And he just looked around like we're literally in the middle of nowhere, and he said, well, how am I going to check? Like, I don't have a computer or anything. So he stamped me out. He said, you're leaving the country. My husband was not very happy, and I was just like, oh, we'll just have our holiday in Argentina. We'll worry about it later. And we came back through Osorno, so we decided to come back through a bigger passport control. And they said, oh, you've got 2 Chilean kids. Here's your permanent visa. It's like, okay. If I'd known it was that easy, I would have left a lot earlier.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm quite aware of the Tramite situation. I lived in Argentina for a year, and the funny thing is that the Argentines paint the Chileans as being ruthlessly efficient compared to them.
Oh my God. They were. I'd have to check in with the federal police all the time, and every time if I wanted to leave the country with the kids without my husband, I'd have to get a letter from the federal police saying that I was allowed to go on holiday with my mum to Buenos Aires or whatever. He never needed it, which always pissed me off. He could take them and kidnap them if he wanted to. We managed it somehow. As you know, those Latin American countries are very bureaucratic. You basically need a certificate to prove you're not dead. So everything you do, you have to have no to read. And, when we moved house, we'd have to have the driver's license of the truck driver, that you have ID cards in Chile, so you'd have your route what time you were moving, just to prove that you weren't stealing things. And then you'd move into the house and they would have taken all the light globes. It'd get dark and you'd go to turn the lights on, there'd be no light globes.
Yeah, again, another massive education, probably 8 years there. You were in Apalta for the whole time, were you?
No, we started in Apalta. We were probably there 4 years. And then I'd gone out on my own doing consulting, and Pete decided to leave his job because he was employed to do a small, ultra premium Carmenere Cabernet project. And then they bought a winery which turned out to be a bulk winery. And he's not a big winemaker. So he came in with me and we did consulting. So we'd work with a number of wineries throughout Chile. So from Casablanca right down to almost Itata. China was starting to open up. So we were making wine to be sold into China. Pete was going to China, making wine in China. So it all kind of worked out. We had our own little business, even though I wasn't a permanent resident. This is what cracks me up. I don't know how we managed to do it all.
And at that stage, was Chile already quite focused and technically proficient as it has become, or did you see that evolution while you were there?
Much better than Europe had been when we left Europe. Miguel Torres really introduced modern winemaking in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, and then a lot of the winemakers in Chile had gone to California. So they'd seen a lot of that sort of, there was refrigeration, there was inert winemaking, there was oak alternatives, but it was just not as much probably sense of urgency as we give in Australia around vintage. It was like, it's lunchtime, it's onzies, it's 11, so we've got to go and have a little bit of a nap and an hour and a half for lunch. And you're like, there's fruit coming in. It's like, mañana, we'll get it done. And they did. They're great. They're very hard workers, the Chilenos, and they're really generous, kind people. So it was good fun. Again, I didn't really speak Spanish when I moved there, but, I learned.
If we can dwell on Chile a little bit, because it's a place that is really quite interesting for wine. You mentioned Casablanca down to Itata, so a big stretch of land between those. Just a little overview, if you could, of, I suppose, the varieties you worked with, maybe from the point of view of what's exciting where. So
for me, Cabernet's beautiful in Chile. It sort of has Bordeaux-esque tannins, but some of that more Robinery fruit. The best Cabernet for me is from that Alto Maipo region. So if you're looking at Santiago, you're going up to Pirque into the Andes, where it's a little bit cooler. Carmenere is best in Colchagua and probably at its ultimate best in Apalta. I know people sort of equate Carmenere as being this sort of green methoxypyrazine characteristics, but where Pete was, his vineyard was 96 years old. When he started there, all on own rootstocks, and there was a bulk sort of vineyard, which is in a perron overhead system, but mostly it was this tea trellis, and it just gives this beautiful roasted beetroot, blueberry characteristics with these sort of Shiraz-ish tannins, and handled judiciously in oak. You could make some amazing wines. When we were there, they were very big on oak, and we just said, you don't need to have that, you can pull back a little bit. And then if you're moving further south, some of the aromatic grape varieties, Gewurz and Riesling in Itata. Now the infrastructure's better. There's really one road in Chile. When we lived there, only 20% of roads were paved. So once you got off the Ruta Cinco, which is the main road, it was dirt road. And Argentina is a little bit similar, Mendoza. Just building up that infrastructure has allowed them to transport fruit in a better way now. Most of it's hand-picked because labour's still very, very cheap. Machine harvesters and petrol and diesel are expensive, so they still hand-pick, and they're paid by weight. San Antonio does great Pinot. Casablanca, I think, does good Pinot, but I think they rely on the 777 clone, which is not my favourite. I think that's a really good sparkling clone. I don't think it's a really good table wine clone. And I worked with one vineyard that had some Pommard and some Dijon clones in there, which were amazing. Water's obviously an issue on that side of the Andes because they rely on spring water, subterranean spring water, or a little bit of rainfall because they don't get any Andes water melt, and they're obviously suffering from massive drought, particularly since a lot of the waters from around the Aconcagua has been taken for avocados. So it has changed. They're struggling, but like Australia, they did the cheap and cheerful and fantastic, and they're really good premium wine regions, and really good winemakers. There's the volume producers, of course, but it has a great future, and the climate is just so ideal. We check every night on SBS, we see 28 during the day and 12 at night. And even in summer, 35 during the day, 12 at night. It's just perfect weather and very low disease pressure.
Yeah, I feel like a little bit like perhaps the perception of Australia among some people overseas, the fact that Chile has done such a good job with very well-priced wines at volume means that perhaps people overlook some of the detail, which has only become more and more interesting over time. Do you manage to kind of keep an eye on those sorts of latest trends coming out of Chile as well?
We sold a business to a friend over there, and Pete still goes every year because we still sell some wine from Chile to China and also with Asda Walmart. So they do a lot of Sauvignon. And there's a group called MOVI, which is the movement of enologists and viticulturalists, sort of innovators. That's how it translates. And they're doing some really good stuff. They're doing a little bit of orange wine, some of them, a little bit of sort of natural wines, but they're also picking site, which is kind of what's happening in Australia. I think that you're seeing that much more specific focus on what grape variety suits what area, and it's down to very site specific. And because it is such a hilly country, aspect is obviously really important, and so some sites are just ideal for Cabernet, some are great for Cabernet Franc. The sort of broad plain winemaking is for the volume, they've got the water. But it's still, I would even argue Australia's still sort of in that phase as well. We just don't know. We don't have, centuries of winemaking history.
Yeah, and it sounds like a really active, you were there for a long time apart from anything else, having family, having a business, trotting all over the country, I should say. It must have been a pretty fun experience.
It's such a great time, honestly. We sort of talk about it, now that we're older and looking at our superannuation going, we probably should have put a bit more money into super back then, but we were having such a great time. Too bad. Life is more important than potential retirement. And we say that to our kids now, just get out there and travel and have fun and enjoy. Worry about the future another day.
Were the kids old enough to remember Chile?
Elliot, yes. Luca, probably not. He has some. He struggled more because he was 2 when we returned, and he struggled with his language because the way the brain works, that is a really important time. So he spoke like Speedy Gonzales when he moved back here. No one can understand him.
And so what happened when you came back?
So we moved back just because Chile's not a meritocracy, and I did not want our children to be raised to think that they were special, and they were treated very differently at, when Elliot was at kindergarten. Yeah, he was just, kids' heads could be bleeding, they could be in a coma. The teachers couldn't care less because there was a little redhead kid running around and be like, oh, don't worry about Diego, we've got this really cute little white kid here. So we didn't want them to grow up thinking they were special. So that's what was one of the prime movers to moving back here, because I'm not from money. I went to a state school, high school, and we started up a business. We had Southern Cross Wines in Chile, and we started up Southern Cross Wines here. We were doing some brokering of wine to China and in and out of Australia. I was doing, obviously, WSET education and doing some consulting to wineries in the Yarra Valley. And it's just sort of grew from there. And then I got a proper job at Helen and Joey. I was consulting to them, and then I went full-time as their winemaker for about 6 years, and then moved to Rob Dolan Wines during COVID, where I am now.
And what about the MW? We haven't even worked out where that fits in.
So when I was in the UK, the woman I worked for, she was a master of wine, Angela Muir, and she owned Cellar World with her husband. She was quite well known in the UK trade because she'd had this amazing wine shop in Fulham, the Fulham Wine Centre, and the likes of Oz Clarke would drink there, and that's how he started. He started by training under her, and she just said, I want you to do your MW, and I said, sure, if you'll pay for it. And she went, okay, we'll pay for it. So they did. I had no idea, honestly. I remember turning up, so I'd been in France, and I got off a ferry, and I drove up to Odney Club, which is Waitrose own. It was this Jacobean mansion, beautiful, but just the accommodation was absolute. I imagine what English boarding school accommodation would be like. It was pretty hellish. And I didn't have wine glasses. Everyone had fancy wine glasses, so I was having to use the Odney Club's like really cheap wine glasses because I just hadn't been organised. And they were talking about the Rhone and Barolo, and honestly, Ed, I had never heard of these places. I was really good, like winemaking wise, but I had not heard of half of these places. So I dropped out after my first year, and my co-worker was doing her diploma. So I said, I'm just going to study your notes while you do your diploma. And so I just read all her notes and then re-enrolled the following year and sort of went, oh yeah, no, I know where the Southern Rhone and the Northern Rhone. Obviously I was working in Europe, so I had a much better idea after a year. But I just remember sitting there going, oh my God, I don't know what they're talking about. I could taste, but I was a technical taster. Is this wine faulty? What's the acid like? Is it in balance? So it was quite a journey to get to tasting like an MW.
Yeah, and in massive contrast really to today, where people are very organised, I feel, when they go into that program, and certainly aren't going to be surprised by a name like Barolo. But apart from that, anything else, there's the investment in it and the difficulty of doing it and having all your ducks in a row, I suppose, to start the course. It sounds like it was a very different experience for you. But again, you had that experience of still, making friends and connections, and again, it sounds like you made a bit of an adventure of the whole thing, really.
It was fun. There's one friend of mine, Xenia Irwin, Xenia at Ruscombe King, she's a buyer for Waitrose now, but she was really into single malt whiskies, and we went through every single malt whiskey in the Odney Club, because it's all free, and we got up the next morning, we had a fortified wine exam, and I think half of us walked out to have a bit of a throw up, because as soon as we smelt the alcohol, we're just like, oh no, and we were all smoking ciggies back there. We'll be going out for a bloody Marlborough Gold halfway through the exam. It was a very different time.
How long ago was that?
So I would have started, I reckon, in 97 at the Odney Club, then dropped out 98, re-enrolled 99, sat my first exam in 2000.
Right. Obviously, again, these days, I think people probably are on a bit more of a career progression when they know what they hope they're going to get out of it, I suppose, when they get into it, not at least because of the amount of work and expense involved in doing it. But for you, again, different kettle of fish, you were talked into it without really knowing what you were getting yourself into. But some of those other MWs that you met in the course, all doing pretty interesting things and quite diverse things, I'd imagine, by now.
Yeah, they are. So Nora Robertson, he's in Spain making wine with Grenache. I'm the godmother of his firstborn son. I actually got him into winemaking because he wanted to start winemaking, and I said, look, I'll give you a gig in the Loire. He had no skills, and I was a little bit nervous, but because I spent a lot of time in the Loire, I could kind of help him out and hold his hand a little bit. But he was working with a great guy called Eric, and Eric was actually, unlike a lot of our clients, was very generous with his time. Yeah, Xenia Irwin, a lot of people didn't finish. I reckon there were 25 of us, probably, that started, and maybe 6 eventually graduated. Alistair Mailing, who was at Villa Maria for many years, he of course got through, in one go. Tim Atkin, the wine writer. Who else got through? Not a lot. Not a lot of them actually finished. But yeah, great fun. Tim Atkin was great because he lived near me in South London. Because he was a journo, he got sent all these samples. So we'd have a tasting group on Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock, and you'd have to go through and go into his room and pick out like a theme that you do, and you put together the wines, and we'd all sit down. And he was very generous with his time. It was good fun.
Yeah, very handy. How do you think that the MWs helped you over the years? What have you used it for?
I use it when I want to get into tasting rooms when I'm travelling through Europe that I probably normally wouldn't be able to get into. When I got it, I remember I was filling a tanker in Chile, and they rang. I ran upstairs to speak to the woman, and she said, "You've passed your MW," and I went, "Okay." And then there was an earthquake. The earth literally moved the day I got my MW, and I said, "Look, I've got to go. There's an earthquake, and I'm filling a tanker, so see you later." So I just went back to what I was doing. It certainly opened doors. People respect you more, which I think you do need to back up. I don't think that you can just use that as a, master wanker kind of thing. You need to deliver the goods at the end of the day. It's made me constantly want to learn about wine. I think you just never stop learning. Wine is just the most amazing industry. It's always changing. Yeah, I don't know. My husband said he thought MW stood for my windfall, and clearly no, that wasn't the case. So now it just stands for my wife. So
But you say you never stopped learning. You also pretty much never stopped teaching because you've been very constant. You mentioned the Wine and Spirit Education Trust teaching early on when you came back to Australia, but you probably would have seen, I would imagine, more students go through WSET than any other person in Australia.
Yeah, well, we introduced it into Chile in 2000 and, I'm going to say 3. I was pregnant. So it hadn't been introduced into Latin America before. And then when I came back to Australia, I spoke to the Prince Wine Store, and they were looking at doing the diploma, and that was in 2010. So I've been back a couple of years. And we had to write all the material for the diploma in 2010. You weren't given it. Yeah, I know, it's just crazy. So I had to write all of this material and then sort of deliver it. There was Kate McIntyre and I were the only MWs. We're using Michael McNamara at the Prince to do Italy, Philip Rich to do Burgundy, but of course they weren't teaching in the WSET way. So it has developed over the years. So yeah, I mean, it's 15 years here of diploma students. And then all the level 3s. I mean, I have to say, no matter where I go in Melbourne, whatever restaurant I eat at, you'd be the same, Ed. There's someone there that you've taught.
I think my wife finds it quite funny. There'd be such a celebrity in probably the most minute way possible.
Well, I know, it's a tiny little world. I did an event a couple of weeks ago for Melbourne Food and Wine at Estelle for Women in Wine Victorian thing, and my niece came and she works with the Pickett group at Smith Street Bistro, and she was just like, oh my God, Auntie Meg, like, people know you. And I said, yeah, but the world is this big, Hannah. Like, it's not like I'm famous, but yes, people do know who I am. But it's great because you always get a special little something in your meal.
Yeah. What is it about teaching that keeps you coming back for more?
Makes me keep learning, because you've got to be smarter than your students, as you know. I just love, particularly with WSET, that we now have a really formal qualification that is globally recognised, so our students can travel anywhere in the world, and we're all speaking the same language. It is very prescriptive and it has its faults, but it's a really good foundation. And just seeing the passion of the people. I mean, wine people are a little bit mad. We don't make a lot of money. If you want to work in the wine industry, across any area, you don't make big bucks. We spend a lot of our money on wine that we probably can't afford. But we're interesting people. They're great people. They're passionate about their product, and they're doing it for enjoyment and love rather than just to put, money in the bank, basically. And that's what I love about teaching, and see the progression of the students. And, when you first did that Barolo with them in, I think it's level 2 or level 3, and Barolo is not a friendly wine, and their eyes just kind of light up going, oh my God, yeah, I get it. When you put a great glass of wine in front of people, they just see it. And I love that moment, the Barolo moment, I sort of call it.
And it's interesting when you say that wine people are a bit weird or whatever, a bit different. I also think they're probably not as homogenous as people think in terms of what that weirdness is. I mean, they do tend to be passionate and curious, but they're not all the same person. And I think that I was talking to Andrea Pritzker, another master of wine, mentioning that we didn't really expect how social it would be in terms of people getting to know each other in a classroom and making friends and really bonding, who were from quite different backgrounds. I mean, it's quite an international set of people you tend to get in those. There's a really good gender split, which you can't say for all parts of the industry, but within the WSET courses, and amateurs as well, coming from quite different backgrounds who, for whatever reason, they've just been bitten by the bug. They like being there, and they feed off each other and each other's passions in a way that I think might be surprising to people from the outside.
Yeah, and they're also very generous. They're generous with their knowledge. They're generous with their wine. You're amongst like-minded souls. I think that's basically what it comes down to. Even though it's not all of your world, it is a part of the world that I just love it. And I'm getting older now, and I've been in it for a long time, and I'm still constantly amazed by wine. I feel, my husband brought home a bottle of wine that he'd made, and I was just like, oh my God, that is just such a beautiful expression of Yarra Valley Chardonnay that I haven't seen for ages. So I said, bring home another bottle. It's really delicious.
One thing that has been relatively new to your quite considerable skill set is podcasting itself. You've been running Wine with Meg Mel for, 5 years, I'm going to guess?
Yeah, we started in COVID.
How's that been?
It's great fun. We were both working at Brodtmannesque Wines and COVID hit and we had no way of communicating with our customers. So Mel said, look, they're stuck in their car or they're stuck at home. Let's do a podcast. And it started out pretty hokey. You know, we were recording it it's literally a glass box, so the sound quality probably was pretty shite. And then when Mel left Rob Dolan's, we decided to move it out of... So Rob was basically sponsoring us. We moved it out of that and we went sort of out on our own. Sometimes I think we wing it, but then sometimes I look at the amount of planning that Mel puts into it, and I'm winging it off her amazing planning. You know, she's like, we're doing a podcast, just a news podcast tonight, and she sends me all the questions and she has a whole Google Docs thing, and I just kind of sometimes just turn up and talk. It is good fun.
There's a nice quote I remember from a writer that I really like, who always comes at subjects with a really interesting point of view, where he just mentioned that there are so many really simple questions hiding in plain sight. And I kind of feel like that's probably what you'll find with the podcast as well, that there are some really simple things that are actually quite interesting to talk about. Are there any subjects that you've covered that you particularly enjoyed?
I think the ones that people most enjoy are when we sort of break down talking about wine and tasting wine into really simple snippets, because it is very individual, but you have to train yourself. And so we did a weird episode where we matched wines with like Friday night snacks, so salt and vinegar chips and dim sims and popcorn and things, and that did really, really well, because it's sort of just telling people, just you can learn about it, but just use it in your everyday life wine. You know, don't make it a special occasion. Sorry, that's my dog barking. So I think the ones with the most feedback we get really are the ones where we're trying to teach people how to taste. And it is quite hard because, like you, we don't talk in a posh language. We don't talk in WSET language. Sometimes we do if we're trying to explain things, but we just sort of talk about it in everyday. You know, if you're talking to a mate who wasn't into wine, and he asks you, well, what does this wine taste like? You're not going to say, oh, well, the acid's medium plus and the tannins are, you know, blah, 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 blah. You're just going to say, oh, it's got some really nice fruit and it's really gentle. It'd be great with pizza. And I think that's what we try to do.
Yeah, and it probably gives people permission, which bizarrely I think they kind of need with wine somehow.
I agree.
To just discover stuff, to try it.
Yeah, we did an episode on, was it Piquette? Right? So we used to make piquette all the time in France, and we just drink it at lunchtime. And we tried all these piquettes, and
could you just explain what that is?
So piquette is where you take the grape skins for red wine after fermentation, or the white wine after you've pressed them, and you just add some water and sugar and you ferment it to about 5% on skins. The red wines will be a little bit sour because there'll be a little bit of volatility in them, and then you just drink them. They're 5%, they're a little bit spritzy. It's almost like a seltzer. It's poor man's wine. You know, I first was introduced to it in Gaiac, and we would have a carboy, you know, a 20-litre container with a tap on it, and we'd just keep refilling it with whatever skins came through the day to have a glass of wine at lunchtime, which was a great introduction after working in Australia where, you know, you're not allowed to do anything. And people, like, literally listened to it and raced off to the store to buy the wine, and they could only buy it in certain stores, and we were like, oh, maybe we need to do a bit of background check of where it's actually available. So people are curious, and they want to try. I guarantee they're going to like it, but they want to try new things.
We talked a little bit about the fact that the wine community isn't often in those classrooms as homogenous as people might expect. You did also talk about the early days and the blokiness, and I know that you've been involved in some women in wine sort of things. How do you see that picture sort of shaping up? There are obviously, you know, people will always hark back to some, and there are many stellar women who are really succeeding in the world of wine, but maybe that doesn't do justice to the perspective that is out there.
Look, until we do something about pregnancy and this mentality that the winemaker has to be there 24/7 during vintage, we'll never break the mould. I mean, my husband is as guilty of it as anyone. It's like they become heroes, like, I've got to save the world. And it's like, you know what? If you have a good team, you don't have to be there 24 hours a day. You know, I've spoken to women who are breastfeeding, and they're breastfeeding in pump houses in vineyards. You know, we just need to lose our blokey, oh, we're under so much stress during vintage. And vintage is hard, and you live off the adrenaline, and it is great fun, but really it's doable. You could literally run 8-hour shifts if you wanted to, but there's just not that mentality. And until all these old farts like my husband die off, we're not going to change it. And because they're in power now, and there's not enough women in power. So
I had an interesting conversation with a fellow Yarra Valley winemaker, Sarah Fagan, who's extremely proud of efficiency. She just cares about it, and just would probably echo those sentiments that if you're organised and you're running a good team and you trust them and you're just on top of things, that it doesn't have to be heroism.
No. Fags would definitely go home. I spoke to her today, actually, and she said, oh, yeah, you know, I'm sort of dusting off all the dust and I'm going to go home and cook something nice for dinner. It's trusting other people. Like, I think winemakers have a little bit of a God complex, that they're the only person. They have to see every single grape that passes through that destemmer and crusher. I've never had that. I've always said to, you know, people that I've worked with, go for it. And if they fuck it up, it's all fixable. It's not brain surgery, you know, no one's life matters. I know you only have one chance during vintage. I mean, my husband, you know, he's still working like 7 days a week, and vintage finished kind of 3 weeks. They picked the last grape 3 weeks ago, but you know, the Malos might go through half a gram more without me actually watching them. And it's like, okay. He is of that school, though. I haven't managed to beat it out of him yet.
Having brought us back to the Yarra Valley, I think it'd be good to talk about things in the Yarra potentially that people not in the Yarra don't know about, but also other wines in Australia that at the moment particularly excite you.
Well, the Yarra Valley, I mean, we're going through, I think, a bit of a restructure in the Yarra. Obviously, we've had phylloxera. Grape prices have got out of hand, and we've seen a correction of that this year, which is devastating for the growers, but for wineries, it was needed. We were pricing ourselves outside of retail pricing, and I'm talking about that sort of entry level, you know, Pinot and Chardonnay, not the sort of premium end. Obviously, we do Pinot and Chardonnay beautifully. We know what are the really good sites now, and there's some great producers, you know, like the smaller producers, Jaden Nongs, Stu Jardine at Alchemy, who don't have, Jaden has a bricks and mortar, but Stu gets his wine made elsewhere. We're seeing more and more of that. So these young winemakers, Tilly J, you know, she doesn't have a winery because she can't afford it, but she makes great wine and she's building a fantastic brand. So we're seeing this great influx of young, dedicated winemakers. We recently did a tasting. It's called Pulp, so it's for the more funky styles of wine, and it's really interesting. And the people get to vote on what is their favourite wine. They always vote for a Pinot or a Chardonnay, the most traditional styles of wine there. So even though they're there for some funky styles, they go for the Pinot or Chardonnay. I think the first year Tilly's parents, and I'm sure she won't mind me saying this, she probably won because half her family was there. But her wine is fantastic. So we're seeing this sort of influx of, you know, younger winemakers. Sid at Thick as Thieves doing Arnace. As a result of climate change, we are planting different grape varieties. My husband just planted Chenin. We're seeing some Grenache, obviously Italian varieties, and people just doing what they do best. And it's not always to make money, you know, it's not always the best financial decisions to make, but they're doing it because it's what they love. And in Australia, my heart really is going out for the warm inland regions. They're getting screwed because the big boys have pulled out, and I would love to see them turn into these sort of funky styles of wine and really lower volume, because we can't keep making this much wine. We need a correction. So lower volume, different styles. They've got the perfect climate for it. They've got the water. Production costs are lower, and a lot of these young cool kids are buying their fruit from up there, and you know, even Unico Zello sources their fruit out of there. So I just want to see those regions be supported, but it'll be in a much different model, so it's going to be a few years of pain before we get there.
Yeah, and there is as well. There's a few good ideas as well, and a bit of energy floating around. You mentioned Inico Zello coming at it from a slightly different angle, and Ash at Ricatera, etc. Really trying to, actually, I think making people very aware of what's going on up there. I think a little bit of that empathy lags because they don't see it firsthand what's really happening. But at the same time, there is movement, and I think we've always got to remember in wine, it's a long game as well, so we don't know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, and it is an industry that it goes through boom and bust cycles. Since I've been in the industry, this is the second bust I think I've gone through, and it'll correct. And we need this correction. You know, we've got to remember that all of this vineyard area was planted in the 90s because there was major tax incentives for lawyers and doctors to become primary producers and offset their massive wages, and this is why we've resulted in this mess, which is one of the reasons I would love to see some government support, because it was a government policy that has created it, and then, you know, government that stuffed up China. Thanks, ScoMo. But yeah, I just think the resilience of the people in the industry just amazes me.
I think being a student of yours, I remember sometimes the anticipation after tasting a wine. They were all blind pretty much, I think. When I did WSET, everything was blind. And so there would always be a little bit of a sense of anticipation before a verdict was delivered by the teacher, who was often you. And it was lovely when you realised that you had just sipped something and spat something that you just loved. And on that note, what are those things from Australia and the world that you do just love?
Look, I love anything clear Riesling. I know it's probably boring because most winemakers and people in wine say the same. Riesling never bores me, ever. I famously love Moscato, which people, you know, really diss me for. They think, oh, how can you possibly love Moscato? I just find it really refreshing, and, you know, it's one of those drink, don't think kind of wines, and enjoy it. Chilled reds at the moment, this summer. I'm not a fan of rosé. I just think it honestly is such a waste of space. Sorry, I know everyone produces rosé and they're good profit makers because the cogs on those are really low, but I just don't see the point. If I'm going to reach for a glass of wine, I want a sense of variety or place or winemaking or history or something, and rosé just could be made anywhere. For me, it's just generic. So this summer was my summer of chilled sort of reds, which, just looking at the way different red grape varieties respond to chilling, was, you know, a bit of fun, bit of journey. I put anything in the fridge. It wasn't even supposed to be like cool chilled reds. It was just, let's give it a go.
Stuff in the fridge. So which ones were emerging as favourites out of the fridge?
I had this one. It's like Yalumba or something. They call it Ganache, but it's Australian. McLaren Vale. I think it's like $10 a bottle, but it was just perfect in the fridge. Just threw it in, knocks the alcohol back, because, you know, they often run around 14.5%, but then you've got that lovely strawberry raspberry character, moderate acidity, fairly low acidity, really good barbecue wine on a hot day.
Very good. And on a final note, what is the next glass ideally of wine that you're going to have?
I think I need a glass of Pierre Peters champagne, non-vintage. It's my favourite. We've had a bit of a hell week at work, so champagne is my joy. It just always makes me happy. My whole family's really into it. My brother-in-law, who's an anaesthetist, so he can afford to buy it, he always just has great champagne. He loves Pierre Peters, so I just buy it on the sly. Pete doesn't know, and it just arrives and I just hide it. So I think that's what my next glass will be.
Well, that's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like it, subscribe, share with everyone. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. Comments are hugely welcome. Please let me know what you'd like to hear more of. In the meantime, big thanks to my friends Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Elizabeth Clancy for the edit, and of course, to my guest, Meg Brodtmann MW. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.